All right, good afternoon, everyone. If you can mute, if you're not, for the panelists, if you can mute right now. Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, Thank you for hanging out with us today for the first webinar of the Spring 2022 Justice Education Series, Reentry in Education, a Policy Perspective. So my name is Mako Faniel. At the PD Green program, I serve as the Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Education. So what does that mean? In this role, I'm responsible for both internal and external focused diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So I help volunteers learn how to be ethical tutors. This also means that I help volunteers understand the broader logics and practices that create mass incarceration, and that can produce the educational experiences for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated learners that they serve. And I'm also responsible for helping volunteers become advocates for systemic change by connecting them to the ideas, organizations, campaigns, and people working on changing unjust systems and policies, particularly those that are related to education. So, and this is why we are here this afternoon for the PD Green program's webinar titled Reentry in Education, a Policy Perspective. So over 120 people are with us right now. We're expecting over 100 more. Others will join us on YouTube later. But we're all here to learn about the policy initiatives necessary to expand educational access and ensure educational success for learners continuing or pursuing education post-incarceration. So as you will learn, this is an important conversation because most folks who begin their educational journeys on the inside will most likely complete them post-incarceration. So there have been some wins in this particular space, but the wins that we have are not enough to make sure that there's increased access and that we are doing what's necessary to make it affordable and to make sure that folks that are returning home and pursuing their education are able to do so successfully. So therefore, we need policies and regulatory frameworks for programs that will serve these learners. We need policies that allow for a successful education continuum, and you'll hear that word a lot. Thank you for the College and Community Fellowship for giving us that particular framework. So today our panelists, most of whom are formerly incarcerated themselves, will talk to us about policy initiatives like banning the box, standardization of educational programming, housing support, counseling support, financial aid support, and other initiatives necessary to make sure there's an educational continuum. It will also help us understand what we can do to advocate for the policies that allow for an educational continuum. So yes, there are organizations and folks on the ground that are doing this advocacy and policy work, but systemic change comes about when not only these advocates, but people that are voters and people that are donating and people that can influence, other people can influence change. So throughout this conversation, here's what I'm hoping that you can do. I want you to think about everything that was in place for you. Every program, every opportunity, every dollar spent that made it possible for you to enter higher education and successfully matriculate through. And while you're thinking about that, I want you to put that, juxtapose that with what's necessary for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated learners. So these same opportunities and programs that you had are necessary for people transitioning from spaces of confinement and punitive geographies. So to facilitate our learning, we have selected 3 different organizations involved in policy work for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated learners. They will help us make sense of the problems and the opportunities for advocacy. So in a second, I will introduce you to our moderator, who will then introduce our panelist. But first, I want to explain how we'll proceed. So the moderator will give a brief introduction of himself. Then each panelist will give a flash talk, where for about 5 minutes, they will present to us about their organization, the policies that they're working on, and how we can support their efforts. After the flash talks, the panelists will engage in a brief conversation to extend the discussion. Then we will spend the rest of our time taking questions from the audience. To ask questions, please use the Q&A function, and we will put questions we will take questions from that box. And also during the webinar, please don't hesitate to live tweet your thoughts about what you're learning by using the hashtag PGPJusticeEd. So I know that you have your phones in hand. I will ask you to open up Twitter right now and just say, you know, I'm happy to be joining this conversation, hashtag PGPJusticeEd. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded. So please, govern yourselves accordingly. And at the end of the webinar, please stay on to complete the feedback survey. All right, so now I'll put you in the hand of our moderator, who will then introduce our panelists. So this afternoon, we are excited to have Reverend Erich Kussman join us to moderate the conversation. What's exciting about having Erich is that he was one of the first students who PD Green Program volunteers began working with over a decade ago. He later attended Pillar College, where he graduated with a BA in Biblical Studies. And in 2016, he began formal theological education at Princeton Theological Seminary and graduated with a master's in divinity. He is a fierce advocate for educational programming for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated persons, and making sure that that what we're doing on earth for the most vulnerable and the least of these is representative of a love of God and His and purpose on earth. So thank you, Erich, for the work that you do, and I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you. Everybody, my name is Reverend Erich Kussman, and I serve St. Bartholomew's Lutheran Church right here in the city of Trenton in New Jersey. And I'm just thankful that we all have an opportunity to get together and learn about education through reentry and through just the justice system as a whole. In a former life, and I was reading some of the comments in the chat, you know, I used to have a different name, and it was 380-556C. Yeah. That's that good old state number, that SBI. I know a lot of people are probably familiar with that. And I wound up serving 12 years in New Jersey State prison system. Work like this is important to me, and this is the reason, one of the drives I do what I do. You can consider me a prison abolitionist. And what do you mean by abolitionist? It means that the system that we have is a broken system, and there is another way to go about of being rehabilitative to people that are incarcerated instead of being punitive, to show people that there's life outside of the box and the box that they're stuck in. So I feel it's one of my duties and jobs to help people see and get that boost over that wall in that box that there is another life out there. I do the work that I do because I've seen the horrors and injustices of being incarcerated. You know, I grew up in inner city Plainfield, New Jersey. You know, it's common knowledge that my mother was a heroin addict. So you could only do the math on what kind of childhood I grew up and raised, that I didn't know any better. But I thank Mako for introducing how my affiliation with the PD Green program. As was stated, I was one of the first PD Green students through their pilot program down at Albert C. Wagner Correctional Facility in Bordentown, New Jersey. And if it wasn't for the support of others, I wouldn't be where I'm at today. And that's why I want to stress the importance of work like this, because you're giving people a chance that never had a chance. right? When people lose all hope, you're providing that avenue of hope. And that's the importance of the beloved community, which I so believe in. Currently, I've been working in New Jersey of actually shutting prisons down. You know, Albert C. Wagner no longer exists. We're still working with Jamesburg Training School for Boys. And my main focus right now is Edna McMahon Women's Correctional Facility, which the way we incarcerate folks is inhumane. But, you know, that's probably for another talk than this one. But I want to thank everybody for allowing me to be in your space, allowing me to moderate with these wonderful panelists that I know y'all are gonna love, because my brief interaction with them, there's some amazing folks here, y'all. So I just hope we can all learn together, we could strive together, we could think them hard thoughts together, right? That we all can be a think tank together, that we can see there's another way of doing things than what's presented to us. We could show the world that there is another way. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Stephanie Bazell, who is a director of policy and advocacy at College and Community Fellowship. So, and it's also the acronym CCF. So, Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much. And I want to thank PD Green for having me. I kind of prefer that picture because it looks better than I do today, but happy to be there. So our organization was started over 20 years ago and was one of the first organizations to focus on helping formerly incarcerated women to obtain their college degrees. And this is, I think, something that's really critical because we've had the opportunity to examine the space wherein what it's like for someone who is formerly incarcerated to navigate what can be a very difficult process. Already within higher education, we're dealing with a lot of things that I think people here on the call would just disagree with as a matter of how we view society. It's very hierarchical in nature. It's very much, you know, about excluding other people to show prominence. And to me, that there's a fundamental disconnect with that and how we really want to be engaging people in learning. Learning and in prison should be a portal to unlimited knowledge. And that's what we've seen with the women that we've worked with, is that and I'm seeing in the chat, Skip, who is the hype woman of all hype women, just the power that there is once someone has the provision to education, because it's about what they do with it. And I would say that we agree. We are also coming at this from an abolitionist angle, and our perspective has always been that providing education is a means to give people, if they want, the critical analysis tools to be able to dismantle the carceral system, and not just the carceral system, but the structural and societal inequities that may have led to their incarceration in the first place. And we hear a lot about second chances, about redemption, and we really think that in a lot of instances, it is a first chance. And that people were never provided with the appropriate opportunity within their own society. They come back and realize that their communities have really been divested of resources, and that crime was a natural result of that. It was by no means a rational choice. I came to this work having been in government previously and having worked a lot on different types of policy making, where I felt like I was not in dialogue with the people who were most impacted by the policies that I was driving and that I was writing. And that didn't make any sense to me. How can you know what people are doing? And I think that structure that exists where people are drafting policies without input from people who are directly impacted, whether that be in the carceral system, whether that be in housing, whatever system that might be in, that creates a disconnect disconnect that has fostered into the disillusionment that we're all familiar with today, that we're seeing around America across the board. And so I always am constantly trying to orient myself to making sure that I am in a dialogue with people who are formerly incarcerated as someone who is not formally incarcerated, and that I'm giving them the tools to be at this table the same way that I would be at the table, and to draft bills the same way that I would draft bills. The policy that I would highlight is that we are working on, there's a myth, you're gonna see that the Southern people on this call do not have this same issue, which is there is a myth that it is a red state issue where this denial of education, when in fact New York is one of 19 states, so it's in the minority, where we still do not have access to state-based, needs-based financial aids for our programs. So whereas other states continued even when Pell dried up, New York gaps were filled by private education, but not, and private funding, but not by state-based funding. And so what we really want to do is called Turn on the Tap. It's a tuition assistance program. We want to make sure that needs-based funding is restored. And so people can go to turnonthetappny.org. And also, if you're in a state where your needs-based financial assistance isn't opened up, even though Pell's going to open up in 2023, that state needs to be opened up too. And so we're happy to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm humbled just to be on the same webinar with you. That's yeah, we got to connect one of these days. But our next panelist I want to introduce you to is Syrita Steib, who is the founder and executive director of Operation Restoration, a true OR. All right.
How y'all doing today? I want to go ahead. I'm going to share my screen. I did do some slides to help with today. I'm sorry, y'all, I'm coming. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Okay, good. So as Eric mentioned, my name is Syrita Steib, and I'm the founder and executive director of Operation Restoration. It is a nonprofit organization that focuses on currently and formerly incarcerated women and girls and helping them to transition into society after incarceration. It is our belief that reentry starts on day one of individual's prison sentence. So we try to make contact as soon as possible with women who are incarcerated. So some of the questions that I wanted to make sure that I covered in the flash talk was, the main thing is like, what does my organization do? I'm sorry. So our organization, we do a lot of different things. We focus on 15 different programs. We have a myriad of services that start from something as basic as direct services and ranges all the way through transitional housing, access to higher education, as well as policy and advocacy. The reason that we do what we do is myself, I am formerly incarcerated. I went to prison at the age of 19. I was released at the age of 29. And while I was there, I don't feel that I received any services that served me for release, you know, a lot of times people have this myth that they believe that being incarcerated is somehow reformative, and everything that happens in prison is dehumanizing as well as punitive. And as Eric mentioned before, all of the work that we do, we initiate from an abolitionist lens. We do not believe that women and girls need to go to prison or belong in prison. And our mission is to end the incarceration of all women and girls. So the why we do what we do is very much rooted in that I am a part of the community that I'm fighting for. So every day that I fight for them, I feel as if I'm fighting for myself. Another big thing that we look toward in the organization is like, what does economic equity mean? And how do we implement that throughout the organization as a whole? So for us, we define economic equity as recognizing that true economic equity requires access to resources, not only money, but also networks, information, and opportunity. So if we go back to what the basis of economics is, we know that it's not just financial, it's all of these different things. So we work every day to ensure that the individuals that work for us, as well as the community that we serve, we are striving to get them access to monetary things, resources, networks, information, and opportunities. And the reason that this is so important is because we know that 44% of incarcerated Black women will be unemployed for a period of 5 years. It's not that they might be, they will be unemployed for a period of 5 years. So we definitely work daily to address that issue. I kind of already talked about how I came to this work and why I do this work. And it all stemmed from, you know, while I was incarcerated, meeting so many different women who had diverse stories, diverse backgrounds, but being some of the most ingenuitive and intelligent women that I had ever come across. There's like this fallacy that somehow because you go to prison, you're unintelligent, you're not capable of making a decision for yourself. And that is not the case. And I saw this time and time again, but irrespective of the socioeconomic backgrounds that women who are incarcerated come from, the one thing that most women have in common is that we all were there as a result of trauma. And we often say that 90% of the women who are incarcerated have reported incidences, multiple incidences of trauma. And we often say the other 10%, it just wasn't reported. So that is why I do what I do. And it is really, you know, boils down to being a life or death situation. We don't have the privilege of sitting down and saying that we're not going to address these issues and look at these issues, because for many women in our community, it is actually a life or death situation. They're going to live or they're going to die. There's so many women that are released from prison who didn't have access to healthcare inside and don't have access to healthcare once they're released and die within the first 3 years that they are released from prison. So all of these things that we work toward is trying to make sure and ensure that women released from prison are able to continue living. This was a good question for me about what do we get wrong about education for incarcerated and former incarcerated learners. The thing that I feel like we constantly interrupt, and you can see this is a picture from our college and prison program inside of the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women that we run in partnership with Tulane University, and that it should be different, that somehow we have to make accommodations for people that are incarcerated, or we have to treat them differently than the people who are on campus. And that is totally not the case. Every professor that has taught inside of our program often come out and say, I wish that my students on campus had the attention span, had the hunger, had the will, the desire to work toward their education in the same way that women who are incarcerated do. So I think, and something that I've heard Stephanie talk about multiple times and really appreciate her always bringing up to the forefront, is that the quality of education that's offered in the inside needs to match the quality of education that's offered on the outside. And I think that that is the biggest myth for me, is that somehow, some way, education inside of prison should be different. And just to touch a little bit about the policies that myself and the organization have worked on and are working on now. This is from last legislative session, some of the legislation that the team was able to put forth and pass last session. We passed Louisiana Act 276 in 2016, which removed the college, the box off of college applications for purposes of admissions in Louisiana, making Louisiana the first state to do that. We now have successfully done it in 7 other states, working with advocates on the ground. So that is why I put that up there, because every year we are working toward changing that. Currently, we have a bill filed in Connecticut and New York, and ban the box is a checkbox on an application that asks someone if they have been convicted of a felony. And this is used in order to admit them to college. And most times when people get to that box, they do not go any further. 60% of people just, the attrition rate is atrocious. They just quit. They don't want to do it because they already feel like they're going to be denied. So we are working to remove the box off of applications. A lot of universities and college systems have voluntarily done it, but we know that if it's not legislated, it can be placed back on an application at any time. Louisiana Act 125 was a bill that we passed last legislative session to stop people who are on inactive probation or parole from having to pay probation and parole fees. They were still required to pay a monthly fee, even though they were not being supervised. And then Louisiana Act 126 was also passed in the last 2021 legislative session. And what it did and said was that when a primary caretaker was arrested, that the police must allow the primary caretaker a reasonable effort to contact and make provisions for the child that they are caring for, because we knew that most children were going into the system at the point of arrest with a parent because the parent wasn't given an opportunity to make other provisions for the children. DCFS was the first call. So we were able to pass that legislation last year in Louisiana. And moving forward, all the policies that we bring forth have to do with system reform, divestment, investment, and decriminalization. We will be filing more legislation this legislative session. And one of the main bills that we will be working toward is bills that are relative to parole violations. So when you said, how can you all support the work? This is how you can support. You can get involved or you can donate. And if you take a picture of these QC codes, it brings you to the website where you can volunteer or you can donate. But I think that that is the biggest way to support the work at Operation Restoration, and also getting involved if you see something that needs to happen in your state. And it's something that we've done already. We are definitely willing to work with you to bring that forward. So that's all that I have.
Thank you, Syrita. Wow. I got to get to know you too. So just the importance of legislation and actually, you know, that's life changing right there, because that impacts future generations of providing the opportunities for true justice. So our third panelist, Barbi Brown, is the Reentry Coordinator for the Tennessee Higher Education Initiative. I'm very curious on what that's all about, and I'm making sure, and I know you all are too, so let's hear from Barbie.
Thanks, Eric, and I'm glad I put together some slides to walk you through what that is all about. So let me go and share my screen with you. And we will start that. So my name is Barbi Brown. As Eric said, I'm the Reentry Coordinator with Tennessee Higher Education Initiative. Let's see. I'm transitioning this year into the role of Director of Policy and Practice. So it's really interesting. I'm at a point where really understanding what policies, such as those Sarita has described, can really affect reentry, as well as all the other aspects of higher ed in prison. So THEI is actually a nonprofit. We work between our collegiate partners and our DOC partners to provide, facilitate high quality academic programming, degree bearing programming within Tennessee prisons. So if you look at this diagram, THEI, including academic programs team, which will coordinate all of the activities on the inside for classes, et cetera, including enrollment, registration, all those things that usually we need some help with when we even do it ourselves. We have that team. We have a student success and reentry team, And we'll talk more about reentry as we talk about what higher ed is getting wrong, because reentry is not nearly as prevalent as it should be. And we also have a policy and practice portfolio. So what we do is we can bring our unique knowledge, our unique experience to our collegiate partners in support of our students, and let them know what the TDOC environment looks like. Let them know what our students will experience inside as we facilitate those high quality educational programs. So why do we do this work? Why does THEI even need to exist? We see so many models that just have colleges, universities providing direct services to students in DOCs across the country. And while most are incredibly well-intentioned, many times there's a lack of understanding of what the student needs as far as support services while they are incarcerated. The dynamic, the landscape of a DOC environment is unlike any other. Colleges, universities, DOCs have completely different goals typically. So bringing together two institutions that are so far at the end of their own maps to a collective purpose is the reason THEI exists, to make our students experience full of much less barriers, and to make both of our partners see the benefits for themselves and experience those benefits as well. And why did I get into this work? So I myself am also formerly incarcerated. I did spend 17 years in the women's prison in Tennessee. During that time, I was able to earn my bachelor's degree from a private institution, private university that came in, Lipscomb University, that actually came in. It's an inside out model, meaning that they bring in students from the inside or from the outside inside to have class with us. So with that experience and earning that degree, one, I know that education works. Education works, if nothing else, just to form that fork in the road, to allow us the opportunities to have more doors to open. And also 95% of people are going to be released. So understanding that and having the experience that I did inside a Tennessee prison facility, I understand the lack of programming that will lead to ultimate success of a human being. So again, THEI is important because student success is really human, or student support is really human support, where we seek to support the entire human, not just the student themselves. Some of the policies that we work on, let me kind of give you an overview of one of the things that we do. We're spearheading something called Tennessee Prison College Coalition, TPCC. It's currently made of THEI, THEC, Tennessee Higher Education Commission, the TBR, Tennessee Board of Regents, TDOC, as well as the Tennessee Department of Labor and Workforce Development. Those four after THEI are obviously state agencies. So if we look at the continuum of higher ed, of education in prison, then we really have to start with TDOC, right? So if we look at anything as far as data collection, as far as providing student support from the very beginning, as Sarita talked about, reentry starts from the very beginning. So if we're combining education and reentry, even if we take something just like data creation, we have to start from one partner as it progresses to the next. So our intention with this coalition is to bring together all of the partners that ultimately will create that continuum of education and make sure that we all get on the same accord, make sure that we're all on the same page, make sure that we can share pertinent data and also collect that pertinent data in a very equitable way. And to do that, we've broken our TPCC studies down to three main subgroups. One, a program quality indicator group. The purpose is to develop that indicator tool for TDOC to use when they come into contact with new partners to ensure that we're still providing that equitable and high quality learning experience while also preventing harm. Data and evaluation to develop a plan and to provide some guidance on how to ethically and equitably access pertinent data for the student experience. And then our learning community, which is to create a HEP learning community to support all of those involved in the process. Forgive me for my cat that you see in this blur. All of those partners involved in the process so that we can, spread the word, spread the good word, spread the gospel, that this is our community, this is how we do it ethically, equitably, and still provide all of that high quality info. So let me stop sharing my screen. That's just one example of what we do as far as policy, as far as programming, and really ultimately behind something as large as a statewide coalition is to be able to address policy. How better can we address any policy issues across the state than to do it on one accord? And as Stephanie was talking about, this is not a red-blue state or red versus blue state issue. Tennessee is so red that you can see some blue peeking out, but luckily we have some blue peeking out in the correctional education area. And that's what we want to take advantage of right now to get everybody on the same page and to make those changes before that 2023 Pell Grant is released. And we have so many new partners coming in. We want to make sure that we have a framework to address all of those policy needs as well.
Thank you, Barbie. Wow, you are active. Do you sleep?
I think I live in my car, Eric, to tell you the truth.
I get you. My car has become a second office. So I think we could all say that, the way we drive around everywhere. But, that call of justice, you follow wherever it leads you. So, all right. So I'd say give a round of applause, but we're all on a webinar. So it's kind of hard to do. But, at homes or at work, wherever you're at, just give a little clap like so to the panelists. I think with this, they're amazing folks. And I just encourage anybody, just start having them thinking processes, because I've heard some things I've never heard before, right? So there's always people thinking outside, and that's why it's important to have webinars such as this so we all can learn from one another. So nobody's an island to themselves in this work, even though sometimes, and I know the panelists will testify to that, you feel like you're an island to yourself because it's hard pulling resources. It's hard getting the legislations passed. It's difficult. But right here, there's a support network. You see, there's other people doing it also. So that's why it's always important to collaborate. So let's jump into some juicy questions. Are you all ready? Who am I going to pick on first? This one's going to be for Stefan. Are you ready? All right. So I'm wondering if you can help us understand both the abolition of Pell Grants in 1994 and its recent restoration. How did both happen? When is Pell restoration set to take place? What does restoration mean for those who will be completing their education on the outside?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question of how this happened goes to a larger question of how we perceive incarcerated people in this country. And it's really abhorrent. And I think that we should measure our country by the standards of which we value those with whom we treat the worst. And in this case, that is incarcerated people we treat as less than, despite how overwhelming, as Syrita was speaking to, knowledge that people have, resilience, just in the face of a system that is perpetually punishing them. So it was brought about because, and some people may be familiar with this, it was very much in the zeitgeist because of Biden. The restoration of Pell was really a targeted strategy that began way prior to those who were in power, who saw crime as a proxy for race. They were in a situation where they no longer could have openly speak explicitly to racist policies, but they wanted to subjugate Black and Brown people. And so over time, there was deliberation, certainly in the Reagan administration, the Nixon administration set this off, on how we could move people into that area. And that is not a new concept. They came up with that. If you go all the way back to English, even Roman policies, there was a way that people found that they could have marginalized communities associated with certain crimes, and the way in which they criminalized and over criminalized certain areas. So that should be, by no means am I suggesting that any population was conducting more criminal activity, but there was a series of policies put in place to basically take away as many resources as possible and then see how people would survive. So Pell restoration was part of the lock them up and throw away the key, essentially saying that our cities were on fire with crime, and people became very afraid. People became very afraid of this because they saw this as meaning that America was in trouble, meaning that when they were hearing stories about, you know, riots in the streets and all of these things, it got people really riled up. And so there was a sense that you should just, there was no path forward for rehabilitation, even though college and prison had successfully thrived for decades preceding. In many places it started in the 60s, even earlier than that. And if you speak to the Attica uprisings, a lot of that was able to be done because there was coalescing using knowledge. And so people realized, well, knowledge in prison is a way that they're able to have some sort of power. So we need to be taking that away. I think what's happened over time is that people could no longer ignore how ineffectual these policies were. We've had mass incarceration on both sides of the aisle. People have recognized that it is really overly bloated. It costs people an enormous amount of money. In New York City, it costs now close to 500,000 people, $500,000. Sorry, not people, it costs $500,000 to incarcerate a single person. That's in New York City. And yet we're still allowing it. And it's because of America's addiction to penalization and to being really punitive, especially at points at which we feel weak and we want to diminish people to less than. However, there's no more way in which we can reconcile mass incarceration and all that's come out of that, and how it's been totally demonstrated to be bloated and to be beyond something that we can withstand with the reality that people are seeing on the day-to-day basis. So Pell was reinstated. It was very much led by directly impacted advocates who were able to communicate all of the things that education meant to them, which I leave to people to formerly incarcerated to communicate. But I will say that they need to be recognized as the ones who really ultimately won this fight, though there was a lot of partnerships with a lot of different organizations that did that. So it will be restored in 2023. And that will be an opportunity for a lot more colleges, particularly community colleges, colleges with less resources, to come in and offer college and prison programming. And what College and Community Fellowship wants to do as a nonprofit that supports people who are in their journey of being formerly incarcerated to continue their education is to make sure that we do this new landscape of college and prison correctly. And so our call to action amongst all these people who are now going to be joining in the field is you really need to think about what your responsibility is as an educational institution. And that should not be a deficits-based approach. You should not be thinking about justice-impacted people as people who need more attention because of anything like that. They are an asset. You are lucky to have justice-impacted people who are interested in your educational institution. However, much like all adult learners, they have specific needs, just like veterans do, all the people who enrich the tapestry of the educational experience. And so that would be all our call to action, especially amongst those on the call who are considering college and prison programs. And we're happy to have conversations with you as you navigate a lot of different things. People will present issues, for example, like that they can't have reentry programs because their Department of Education forbids it. Or I saw in the questions that there were particular needs. There's also dealing with student loan default. There's a lot of different issues at play, and we want to be here to really shepherd appropriate responses to that so that they can never take away college and prison again.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's shoot for the next question. I'm going to ask Syrita. Are you ready, Syrita?
Yep, I'm always ready.
All right. So in your work with Operation Restoration, but I'd like the term the OR now, that's the real operating room, right? As part of the Unlocking Higher Education Coalition, you've worked at the state and federal level to get policies passed that increase access to education for formerly incarcerated folks. Can you talk to us more about the differences in doing this work at both levels, and why is it important to do so?
Well, honestly, as one of the founding members, along with CCF of the Unlock Higher Ed Coalition, I think it just made sense that we started working on the federal level, and we had already been working statewide, because we also know that a lot of the state policies mirror federal policies, and a lot of times they're more strict on the state level than they are on the federal level, because states have the ability to make things even more punitive as long as they're doing the minimum on the federal level. We sat down and we had conversations around the application. So like the Common App, and working with one of the senators on the federal level to see if we could get the question removed off of the Common App. Because if you're using one application to apply to multiple schools in different states, but that one question is on that application, irrespective of whether the school asks the question or not, that information would be shared if a student was using the Common App. We thought about all schools receive federal funding. So if we could make it a federal law to any school that asked the question couldn't receive federal funding, like we just came up with all of these different ways that you could attack the same issues on a federal level that would then force the state to get in line. And one of the things that ended up being a large focus due to the previous executive director at CCF, Vivian Nixon, and her extensive work on trying to do Pell restoration, was that we really wanted to focus on a clean lift for Pell. We were seeing that, there were a lot of initiatives around second chance Pell and how it discriminated against certain people who were incarcerated. So if you had lengthy sentences, and all of these different things, you didn't have access to education through the second chance Pell initiatives. And that was just really problematic for a lot of people. I myself was not able to start my college education in prison until I was under 5 years. And if I went in at 19 and I had a 10-year sentence, I could have had a doctorate by the time I graduated, instead of having to start as a freshman in college upon my release, because the program that was offered to me had to pay for out of pocket, and I was only able to get 30 hours based on the classes that they offered while I was incarcerated. So there were just a lot of issues and problems that a clean Pell ban lift would address. I by no means think that higher ed is perfect in prison or outside of prison. I think that higher ed still has a lot of issues outside of prison, but the hyper focus on prison education and getting it right there when higher education as a whole still is not fixed and is still broken in a lot of ways, I think is another reason why we advocate so strongly. And that is because, again, there's no difference. There should be the same access, the same availability. We shouldn't try to get it perfect in prison when it's not perfect as a whole. I I think Unlock Higher Ed, what it allowed us to do was bring a lot of advocates from all across the country together, show them what it meant to do advocacy, how they should be following policy work, looking at C3 versus C4 work and what that actually meant, and then being able to take their experiences back to the state and start fighting on the state level as well. So I'm grateful for the creation of Unlock Higher Ed and all of the founding members who had the foresight to say that it needed to be done.
Amen. See, to me, being a reverend feels like we're having church up in here. I don't know. This is church talk to me. So, see, church talk should be real talk, not over spiritualized, but we'll get into that another time. But my next question is going to be for Barbie. You ready, Barbie? And this was off a phrase that I hear thrown around on here is because we're often hearing that reentry begins at the moment of incarceration. So what does this mean for educational programming and policy?
Absolutely. So as we know, data has shown that 95% of people are going to be released. And even for those 5% who currently don't have the possibility, their lives are still just as important as those 95 being released. So with regard to education and reentry, as soon as someone walks into a penal facility, there should be, one, the data collection of previous education history. And then we have some pathways that you're offered once you walk into a penal facility, you're incarcerated. You have a couple of paths. One of the paths that by policy in the state of Tennessee that you're required to do is get your GED if you're under a certain age. I believe that's 23. You're actually mandated to get a GED. And then you're sent off to a job. So you have what we call kind of correctional backed educational programs. Some of those are technical, some of those are basic education. You have that path, or you can go to work. So the question, why is higher education, not offered as part of the pathway? So as soon as someone walks in, begin planning for their reentry, begin planning for a more rounded, more successful, autonomous person to walk out of the gates. And part of that is inevitably education. Education allows for, again, more doors to be opened, more doors to even be accessed, more doors to be unlocked. So really that's one of the largest fights and the largest questions in my mind right now is why are we just allowing prisons? One, Eric, I'm total abolitionist like yourself. If they must exist right now, if we can't just wipe them off the face of the earth, then we can utilize this. We can start with education from day one. We can start actually preparing someone for release because that's the ultimate goal. So reentry, we're not going to plan on anyone staying in a prison. Instead, we're going to plan on that person being released, and education is an integral, necessary part of that.
I like that. I like that. So the next question is going to be for anybody to answer. Y'all can answer it all together. But in this wonderful world of the past 2 years with this COVID-19 pandemic, right? It has forced jails and prisons to release thousands in an attempt to limit the devastating impact of the viral spread in incarceration's close living quarters. So how has this impacted educational programming? And that's an open question to any of y'all.
I was going to ask, repeat it again one more time. I caught the end.
So with COVID-19 and the pandemic, right, forced jails and prisons to release thousands in an attempt to limit the impact of the virus, right? How has that kind of release impacted educational programming? Getting people, so.
Yeah, I just wanted to, that piece about how it impacted, I was missing. I know for us, our college and prison program, it was severely affected. In Louisiana, we were really behind technologically. So the people who were incarcerated, the women that were incarcerated inside of the prison, didn't have access to internet. They still don't have access to internet in the true sense, but they also were not allowed to have laptops and computers or, you know, Chromebooks or anything of the sort. The only folks that had access to Chromebooks were people who were involved in the Second Chance Pell, because it was 100% tablet-based. Ashland was offering the courses in the prison. So we had to go from in-person classes, and what we used to do was pair students with on the outside with students on the inside, and they would kind of act like research assistants and be able to go to the library and get the information that they needed. But there was no way for us to communicate back in real time. We could only do it in study hall or during the in-person classes. So when COVID hit, it literally shut everything down, and we went to like old school correspondence. Like, they were taking the work, sitting it outside the prison. We were picking it up, bringing it to the teachers, getting them to grade it. And then that is how we were communicating. COVID actually allowed us the opportunity to be able to get technology into the women, where now they work through a simulated internet platform that the prison creates and runs. And I have all kinds of thoughts about that, but I'll not go down that rabbit hole. But they simulate it, and they create it, and they control it, and you have to buy a license for it. And they profit off of it a great deal. But what it does allow now is that we have a learning management system where we are able to communicate with the students kind of like in real time. They can ask questions, the professors can answer, and we've been able to have the professors teach online to the students the classes. So we're not just true paper, pencil books, asking questions that way without explanation and being able to communicate. We still are not back in person. They opened up the prison for visitors, and then the Omicron variant hit and they shut it back down again. So we went from in-person teaching twice a week to now 100% remote. But it has allowed Louisiana to take a step into, you know, the 21st century in a way, to allow the students to have access to technology.
All right.
I echo Syrita. So we started with THEI facilitates many in-person courses. However, of course, COVID's going to shut that down. So just like Syrita, we had some successes in the shutdown as far as providing access to more technology, providing access to actually e-learn platforms and typical online platforms that a student outside of prison walls would have access to just on a restricted basis. Students, even though a professor may not be able to come in directly, have access to still speak with a professor, just like an online student would, of course, still with some restrictions. But moving in some more technology, we're enjoying that, but still we want to ride that line to make sure that in-person classes are the priority. And we're beginning to get more professors back inside the facilities to teach those in-person classes. So our goal is to really enjoy both of those worlds, to have this increased technology access while still providing those in-person classes. So if we had to have something good come out of something absolutely horrible, definitely access to more technology, but we don't want to let technology and online learning replace in-person professors when it comes to higher education in prison at any point.
Right. So I'm gonna throw another question for anybody to answer. So what role does the general public, volunteer tutors, and other non-policy makers play in influencing the changes necessary for an education continuum for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated learners?
I would say Well, so the education continuum actually comes from, it's a phrase that we use, but it actually comes from the Department of Education when they first identified creating a reentry framework. They sort of did it as though they didn't necessarily have the resources to construct it themselves. But the idea was that you begin your educational journey inside, and what's going to happen with Pell is that a lot of people aren't necessarily going to graduate. And so what we really need to be doing is looking at these educational institutions that are thinking about and contemplating putting in place college and prison programs and seeing if their policies reflect what we think they should. You should never assume that a college that is interested in providing college and prison programming doesn't have the criminal conviction question, meaning that they won't ban people, they don't have a box basically asking you to check, and then that they're not subsequently discriminating against people within education. Furthermore, they're not only can they be doing a lot of things that are discriminatory, but they often don't supply the resources with which a student needs to succeed. So any student needs to succeed, they need a certain amount of resources. You see that there are student lounges, you see that there are a lot of ways, especially in athletics departments, that people invest in the students that they have within facilities. And from our interviews with people who have moved on that journey from education inside to education outside, when they were suddenly combating a lot of different obligations that they had, that they, were unable to get to while in prison, or that were now suddenly upon them as adults, it was much harder to navigate a bunch of different systems. So educational institutions need to be thinking about, okay, are we providing a safe space for people to ask about things like the use of Blackboard? Are we taking into account the shortcuts that people learn in high school in terms of what they can get around, and leaving people who have not had that traditional experience to think that they need to read through thousands and thousands of pages of things? So for the average person who is not a policymaker, I would implore you to look at the educational institutions that you have connections with and engage in a dialogue with them where you express that you want there to be justice involved students in that educational institution, and that you're seeing the huge stadiums they have, you're seeing all that they give back, and how can they orient that towards supporting someone on their reentry journey. Again, I have to emphasize, it's not distinct from all different people who have all different things that they have to maneuver, and that the Department of Education and that the educational departments in states find ways to uplift and support.
Amen. 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 We're gonna have time for one more question before we turn it over to the panelists. I mean, to the audience, because we want to. I know the audience got some great questions, and I know Anonymous has a great one that's gotten a lot of feedback on the chat. So I want to find just the right question for you all, which I am finding about tutoring. All right. So what role does the general public volunteer tutors know that play in influencing the changes for the education continuum for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated? Like, what more can they do?
I think you asked that one.
Oh, I did? Oh, I apologize.
Yeah.
Oh, here I go. I got it. I'm sorry. I apologize. Please fault me. How do you imagine that tutoring support could be used to support learners continuing or beginning their educational journey post-incarceration? Oh, that's a good one. I like that question.
I think a lot of people benefit and would would benefit from tutoring. I know our students on the inside, we ended up integrating like a college prep type tutoring semester over the summer, because what we realized with our first cohort is that even though people have the tools to have a college education, a lot of them start receiving a college education, I'm sorry. A lot of them have been so out of touch for a while as it relates to their educational endeavors that some techniques, some concepts need to be reinforced or brought back to the forefront. And we saw that with our first cohort that we accepted. So we made a commitment to say, hey, we want to be able to help with tutoring folks and giving people college prep before we just throw them into a rigorous college education. I think also, you know, the people who've brought us here today, PD Green, something that they do really, really well is being able to support, you know, in that manner with students. I know when we first started, we had an employee who came from PD Green who was helping work in our early literacy through adult literacy clinic, as well as supporting in the higher ed program. And I think like without those supports, our enforcements, it becomes a lot more strenuous on the professor as well as the students. And if you just had that stopgap or that support, I just think it can change the trajectory of a person's educational endeavors. And then the last thing is like, it's a confidence builder. You know, if somebody is introduced back into something in a slow manner, instead of just being thrown back into the fire, it gives an individual who's on the receiving end of that education and that learning, the ability to build confidence on what they know and what they feel like they have the capacity to learn. So I think that it's a very important and integral piece. And I know this is the last question, so I don't know if I'll be able to say anything else, but I just want to thank Mako for, you know, putting this together. And I appreciate you inviting me here to share about OR and the work that we do. So thank you.
Thank you. So Syrita, we have to talk. I didn't know that. So we have a college bridge programming that we launched in DC and also in Massachusetts, where we're providing that pre-college literacy and numeracy support for those that are transitioning to college, or in New Jersey for those that are in college at Rutgers University. So we'll talk, and
definitely
you'll have more to say. I'm sorry, Erich.
No, that's fine. Just to piggyback off something else that she highlighted, a great point is that whole college preparation, getting ready. And this is one thing I'll attest to PD Green. If the tutors that came from Princeton University hadn't sit me down and taught me MLA format and APA format, I would have never known how to write a college paper. So those are the life-giving skills that continue on. And that's just something that you kind of highlighted with that college prep that is actually lasting and meaningful. And I still write my sermons that way, which is insane, but that's a whole nother story. So, but thank you. Again, at home, you can do the silent claps for our wonderful panelists, Barbie, Syrita, and Stephanie. Y'all are amazing. Definitely link up with y'all. But I definitely also want to turn it over and give us some time for our audience that's been patiently waiting to throw some questions at us. So we're going to go to
Thank you, Erich. So it's 4:09 right now. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. And so I'll start with this question that was in the chat. I want to kind of like summarize it. So we have two simultaneous movements right now. So we have this the movement for Black Lives, which kind of started this week like a decade ago with the extralegal murder of Trayvon Martin, and then Mike Brown and other Black and brown women and men, LGBTQ folks being murdered, harmed, and then in 2020 the murder of George Floyd. And so there is this movement, this racial reckoning and racial justice. Nonprofit organizations, states, the funding community is wanting to address racial justice. But simultaneously we have a movement to make sure that young people are not equipped with the history or the language or the frameworks to be able to even be able to protest, to even be able to call out, injustice or instances when we're not living up to our democratic ideas. And so how is this playing out in when it comes to the policy initiatives that you all are like working on with prison education and reentry education? There's this racial justice movement, but then also this movement to ban the teaching of history or what they're calling like CRT. So how's this playing out?
That was so much. Go ahead,
Oh,
Steph.
no, go ahead. No, please go ahead, Sarita. I answered in the chat, so I was.
Oh, there's so much in that question. Oh my God. I think, personally, I don't even focus or acknowledge the discussions or the pushback about critical race theory, because I really honestly, truly believe that is a cop-out, and it is a way out of addressing or talking about what is really the situation in the case. There would be no need for Black Lives Matter movement if they mattered, So for me, when you talk about like critical race theory, I think of it in the same way that we talk about, it just puts me in the mind of like thinking about how in Germany, when Hitler rose to fame and they were talking about like the purity of races and all of those things, and that allowed people to bring their mindset to say that this is okay to do this to a group of people because we don't view them as human or the same or pure or whatever. And critical race theory like takes me right back to that mindset of this is a way that we could disavow or not pay attention to what is actually being said with the BLM movement. And this is how we continue to like change or shift the fight to something that takes the focus off of what we're really talking about. And what we're really talking about is that Black lives do not matter to this country. But the way that we take it off is we start talking about critical race theory and how it teaches reverse racism or just all of these things, but it's also a refusal, like I feel like the way that Germany was able to come full circle as a country, they stood up and they apologized. Then they said, hey, we acknowledge that this was an atrocity, this was wrong, and this should not have happened. And we apologize. And they went from one of the most, horrific human loss of human life to like now one of the models for a human justice system, and until America gets to that point to say, hey, the value that we do not place on Black lives is not correct. Slavery was wrong. We apologize. This shouldn't have happened. It's the lack of acknowledgement that allows these arguments to keep popping up, because there's nowhere in history, there's nowhere that says that what happened was wrong. And there were no type of, that there was nothing that was done to try to rectify the wrong or even acknowledge that it happened, So I think until that happens, these things will continue to pop up that try to be in direct conflict with what people are actually trying to say, because reparations have not been made for the wrong that has been done. And, going in a whole different direction, reparations doesn't have to be financial either. Reparations can be financial. It can be an apology. It can be something that is documented to move forward in history that this shouldn't have happened. So I think that is why all of this continues to happen over and over and over again, because America has not made reparations for the reckoning that needed to happen around the atrocity of slavery.
This is an area that I've learned and I understand now, I shouldn't be at the forefront of this conversation. So part of what we do as a higher ed community, one, data collection is really, really important at this point because we need to make sure that our program is equally serving our population. So if we have an incarcerated population that is drastically, heavily of young Black men, then our program should also reflect that. Also, when we sit at tables, policymakers, when we talk to folks, actually, I was on a panel about a year ago, and I'm looking around at white men and myself talking about policy reform and incarceration and criminal justice policy reform. And, sometimes just having this conversation of calling it out. I had the privilege of calling out the fact that there's not a Black man sitting in this circle telling us really how it is while this population is being most affected by the policies of this country. And our students in our programs, I think one of the things that's been most effective is really trying to pass along the information and allowing students to know that their voice still matters in all of these conversations, whether they're inside prison walls or outside prison walls, and allowing, providing avenues for that voice to be effective, not just in the community and in the environment that they can see, but in the larger community as well. Just bringing everyone together that we can for a much stronger voice in these policy movements is something that we really strive to do.
One thing, just to comment on something, there was not too long ago when prisons in New Jersey, and I don't know how it is in the states you all are from, but they banned Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow book. It was not allowed to come into prisons. It's just, and one thing that I've come to discover, CRT is not something new. It's actually a truth telling of the American history, because we like to, as no pun intended or all pun intended, we like to whitewash history, right? So we don't tell the truths about ourselves. So we got time for one more question, I believe. So this is a fun one. Actually, it's a serious one. Oh, wow. So here we go. I am curious about how to support incarcerated students who may have special needs, like dyslexia, but cannot be tested by the HEP provider. Colleges, of course, want to and are required to provide appropriate supports, but there are barriers to doing that with DOC policies. Can someone speak to how their organizations, institutions handle this?
So that's a cop-out. DOC policies as complete BS, because people are supposed to be able to have the same services in prison that they have outside. So if a higher education provider is not providing testing to determine or look at learners with disabilities, they shouldn't be providing higher ed classes. And that's how I feel. There are things inside of the prison that students are supposed to, if they're going through GED, get tested to identify if they have a learning disability. We all know that that doesn't happen in the way that it should happen. So I feel like the quality of testing is something that we could speak on or we could talk about inside of prison, but there's no policy that I know of that says that a student can't be tested for a learning disability inside of an educational program. But DOC will tell you that. They'll say that to you, but it's up to the person that is providing the education in the inside of prison to challenge that, I remember when we first started working in the prison in the higher ed space, we had assistant wardens tell us that we could not show up and support students through their parole and probation hearings because we taught in the prison we were an extension of DOC. And I was like, absolutely not. Where is that in writing? I'm an advocate first, gonna always be an advocate. And if I never am able to go back into the prison, in the college and prison program, that's fine with me. People can teach the classes, but I'm never gonna stop supporting people in parole and probation hearings. But first of all, I need you to show me where it says that in writing, because I don't receive a check from the Department of Corrections. Like, where is that in writing? What policy? So we can begin to address this policy that is inaccurate or should not be there. And of course, the policy didn't exist. It was a preference that the AW at the time had. And when I brought it to the Secretary of Public Safety and Corrections, he was like, absolutely not. They can't tell you that, you know, but you have to be able to push back. I think that a lot of times people that are offering higher ed classes or educational classes in the prison are so afraid of being put out that they endure whatever because they feel like they're doing the people who are incarcerated a service by continuing to teach the class. And you are, but you're also doing them a disservice if you are not fighting to give them the quality education that they need, if you're not advocating on their behalf. And I tell them all the time, like, I'm not afraid to get put out of the prison because I'm gonna find another prison to go into. But what we're not gonna do is like sacrifice what we know needs to be done. And that the people that are incarcerated need to have out of fear. We can't move out of fear. And I think that a lot of times the practitioners are moving out of fear because they have this thought that the most important thing is to deliver the education. And that is true. That is a very important thing. But the most important thing is to protect your students, you know? And if you were on a college campus and something harmful was happening to your students that you're providing education for, you would make sure that they are safe first. And that is the same thing that we have to do inside of prison.
Amen.
All right.
So that's a mic drop right there. Thank you very much, Syrita. You are, the PD Green program is doing this webinar and shifted our model as to make sure that we're no longer agnostic about what high quality education programs are. And so we are engaging in this work because we want to have a say on what high quality education is, and making sure that that volunteers are focused on systemic change, and that it's a transformative experience for both people. So thank you for everybody that participated. I have a larger conversation with y'all, but this has definitely been helpful for my own thinking and helpful for our organization's thinking. Our next webinar, please stay on. I have a few announcements. Our next webinar is on April 7th, and we are specifically addressing the dearth of educational opportunities for incarcerated women and girls across the United States that are confined in various places. So that's going to be on April 7th. And you can register right now, tinyurl.com, PGP Ed for Women. So please do that. Next, so we are committed to hearing from system impacted experts. In fact, over 75% of the people that you hear from over the last 2.5 years for our Justice Education series are system impacted people. And we compensate them for their time and expertise. Of course, this is not, our funding goes towards programming, not for things like this. So we thank you for donating, and we ask that you could please consider making a gift to the PD Green program today. So you can go to our website and click on donate, or through Venmo PD Green program. So please donate to help us continue doing this work.